One of the big secrets to realistic work doesn't come from the detail so much as the value. The first thing you notice when you look at this amaryllis is the beautiful pink details and the gorgeous way these little details curve and the folds and just all the movement that you see here. But before I even started to think about the details, I wanted to get the values down first. Welcome to Sunlit Brushstrokes. My name is Jessica, and today I'm going to be sharing my best tips for achieving this realistic flower with values first and details second. But stay tuned because over the next couple of weeks, I'll be releasing the full-length 2-part tutorial of this flower for free here on YouTube, so you can follow along as I guide you every step of the way. To paint this flower, I started by laying in these subtle, cool-toned washes first. Now this might surprise you because, as you know, most of the time I'm starting with light, warm colors, such as in this flower here. You can see I'm laying down my yellows first, and then I come into my corals. And that is my general rule, lightest and warmest colors first. But what about in a situation like this amaryllis, where there really isn't any real warm colors? There's no yellows, there's no oranges. In this case, the light colors are actually kind of cool toned. They're the shadows. And so you can see I'm painting wet on wet to get those shadows in first. Usually you think about the shadows maybe closer to the end of the painting, but in this case, I made the choice to put those in first because I wanted them to be very soft. And when you look at the reference photo, you can see those shadows are very, very subtle. They're one of the lightest parts of this painting. And so I approached this flower almost like it was a white flower, and I was really excited with the results. The other reason I wanted to add those shadows in first is because I'm working very wet on wet. By the time I get to these beautiful details on the amaryllis petals, I'm going to be working wet on damp or wet on dry. And if I was to glaze over those with my shadow colors, there's a chance I would lose more of the detail than I would like. And so in order to keep that from happening, I went ahead and got all those light, gorgeous, cool shadow colors in first. And by the time I finished part 1 of this painting, you can see the amaryllis really almost stands on its own without the details. Now, of course, the details make this so much prettier, but you can see how much depth this flower already has. And so today I'm going to be sharing with you how you can achieve realism by focusing on values first and details second. One of the secrets to keeping the depth in these initial layers is the order that I go about laying in my color. I went ahead and painted every second petal so that the petals that were kind of in between, if you will, remained dry. Then once I had got these 3 petals painted, I dried everything and came back and painted the remaining petals. This allowed me to keep those petals looking separate from each other, whereas had I painted this whole flower wet on wet all at once, I would have ended up losing the separation of the petals. And so doing one petal separate from another from the beginning allowed me to push some of the petals further back than the others. You can see that this petal here does look like it's behind these 2. And one of the reasons that looks that way is that initial wash of shadows that I laid down at the beginning. The same is true for these 2 petals here. Part of what gives them depth is the fact they do have a little bit of darkness where the edges of each of these petals is meeting the petal in front of it. These ones are a little darker, so it makes these front ones pop and come forwards towards us. When you look at this small supporting flower in the reference photo, it definitely looks more dull, almost like it's receding, almost like it's further away from us, and really almost in the background. In order to achieve that effect in my painting, I went ahead and just covered that whole flower with shadow color first, and in the end I even ended up glazing it with a little bit more shadow color because the details in this one don't really matter. And so you can see the key to making this painting work was to focus on the values first. But I'll be honest, it's really hard to break a painting into layers like that before you even get started, isn't it? The thing that pops out to your eye is these details, it is the pinks, and the shadows just kind of almost disappear into the background. So how do you train your eye to see them? First, you might start out by looking for the most obvious ones, like this flower back here. As I mentioned, it really recedes in the reference photo. I didn't make mine quite as dark because I didn't want to have a black background, but I most definitely still took advantage of the shading that's on that one, and I pushed my flower back with those darker values. But how about on our amaryllis? Here's some tips. Start by downloading your reference photo onto a device where you can zoom in and look at those shapes a little more closely. When you really zoom in, you can see, you can see there's a nice shadow here. This is not pure white. And when you isolate it like that, it's clearly in shadow. Same with this section over here. And you can ask yourself questions like, How is it that I can see this fold in the petal? The answer is that all along the edge of this particular petal, there's a shadow, whereas this piece has a lot less shadow, and that's what makes it stand out. And as I mentioned, you can push one petal behind another by darkening where the edges meet. And that often happens naturally in the photo. You can see when you zoom in here, it is darker on the back petal compared to the front petal. You can see that continues to happen down here and over here. Once again, you see more darkness on this back petal over here. And definitely here, you can see that same thing happening. It was difficult to see that overlap right here, but I took some artistic license and darkened the back petal anyways. And sometimes when you do that, that can work really, really well. It turns out you can see these concepts happening both with the cool tone shadows and with the pinks. So training yourself to see subtle value shifts can be so helpful for creating realistic work. But don't let that intimidate you, because guess what? There were times in this painting that I discovered I wanted to still push those values a little darker at the end. And so even after I got all of my details on, I did come in a few areas of this painting and I pushed those shadows just a little bit darker, a little bit deeper, and I was able to just push that sense of depth a little bit further. I had a hard time deciding whether to paint the pinks next or the greens, but I decided to go ahead and go with the greens because I wanted once again to be able to paint wet on wet and get really soft diffuse edges to my greens without having to worry about how the pink and the green were going to interact with each other. As you probably know, pink and green are across the color wheel from each other, and when you mix those colors together, they can very quickly become mud. So I wanted to do my best to keep those colors separate from each other. And even though there's not a definite right or wrong approach to how you lay these colors down, I decided to go ahead and get those greens on there and let them dry before I came in with my pinks. That way, when I came in with my pinks, I could just focus on the techniques that I needed in order to achieve all the beautiful details that you can see here. Some people might think about wet on wet as a technique that you want to use when you want to paint loose. But as you can see here, I worked wet on wet for my shadow colors and for the green so that I could avoid having muddy glazes later. I consider wet on wet as the crucial step to any painting. It's a technique I always start with and often will use on and off until the end, as you're gonna see as I start into my pink details. The outline for this Amaryllis is available on my Etsy shop, and you're gonna notice that it doesn't have every single crease and fold that's on my reference photo. But then when I went and traced my outline onto my watercolor paper, I put even fewer creases and folds. I wanted just enough to give me a guide when I went to go paint my details later. Most of the time, I'm going to be looking at my reference photo to figure out approximately the direction, the flow, and the movement of these creases and folds, but I'm not trying to paint every single one. And I definitely don't like to count, because that would be tedious. Instead, I focus on the direction and the way that those creases and folds kind of move, the way they curve, the way they twist, the way they turn, and just keep a few basic lines from my original outline to give me some guidance and keep me from deviating too much from the reference photo. And as you see, if you join me for the full tutorial, I guide you through a couple different approaches for doing this. You can start by laying on those wet on wet details and then give it a few seconds, start working wet on damp, and kind of build up. But I actually found it more helpful to get my wet on wet details, or maybe you want to call them glazes of color. I got the lightest pink ones on first, dried everything, and then wet everything just to the stage of dampness so that I could work wet on damp. And I actually preferred that technique. But you're gonna see I went a little bit back and forth between both ways of doing things. If you're enjoying today's video, I would love to invite you to join my free newsletter. In it, you'll find creative inspiration and be the first to know about new tutorials, classes, and workshops. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, you can find a link in the description below. Now let's get back to painting. If you're new to painting wet on wet versus wet on damp versus wet on dry, you can go ahead and do a little practice sample page for yourself. What I've done here is I've taken my Amaryllis and I have traced just this one petal onto some watercolor paper. This is Arches 140 cold press, just because whatever paper you practice on is going to help you understand the paper you're working on. And 140 pound cold press watercolor paper is my favorite paper to use. So I'm going to go ahead and work wet on this one so that you can see the difference in wet on wet versus wet on damp. So I'm wetting this shape and putting quite a lot of water on here. And if you watched my channel at all, you know that these Simply Simmons brushes are one of my favorites for beginners. They hold less water and give you more water control. And so I'm actually going a little wild and really dumping the water on here, just so you can see what happens when I have too much water and I'm working really wet on wet. So I've got this slightly larger brush, it's a number 8, I'm using it for my water, and then this slightly smaller brush, a number 6, I'm going to use it for my paint. And I'm going to come in here, this is just paint that's dried in my palette. It's a semi-moist paint, so it's not as dry as some watercolor paints maybe, but I'm going to take some on my brush, and I'm going to try now and do the details when I have too much water on here. You're going to see what happens. So I'm going to come in here and just paint those details on. You can see they are just blooming all over the place. Now, what can you do if that's happening? You can take a little bit of control by using this separate brush, tap it out, tap that water off of it. This is the brush we painted our initial water with. And you can kind of guide that paint around using what I call a thirsty brush. It's clean, it's a little bit damp, and it's helping pick up the excess water and it's giving me some control. So if you struggle with water control, having a brush like this, super helpful. You can try this technique with whatever brush you have. You can see I'm pulling some detail back in by soaking some of that excess water out. And I'm using the direction of these creases and folds that I see in the petal so that in the end, it still looks realistic, right? So that's an example of very wet on wet. Now that I've pulled some of the water out of there though, let's see how these details behave. I'm coming in once again with my brush, and you can see I'm actually achieving a little more control. I'm going to go move my brush upwards. Sometimes you can get these little, when you come down like this, when you lift your brush, you can end up with like a little bloom at the bottom. You can clean those up by using your damp brush. Sometimes you can avoid them by just dragging that up into an area of your painting where you don't mind a little bit of either a bloom happening, or bringing your brush up to the edge of the petal, and when it gets dry, things are kind of just stop and you don't get that bloom. Or finally, you see right here, I got a lot of control because things are drying and it's almost more damp. So I can soften that out a little bit with a wet brush, or this might be at stage where you want to start working wet on damp. So when things are getting a little drier, you can come back in and you're going to see, whoa, now I'm maintaining a lot of detail. And so I can keep doing that at this point and get all those fine details in. Now, I'm not using my reference photo to make sure I'm getting these perfect with what the photo looks like. You could definitely do that. If you want to practice and get your petal looking as close as possible to the reference photo, that would be great to do. All I'm doing right now is just showing you how you can achieve different textures by either adjusting the amount of water you place on your paper, lifting excess water out, or just giving it a few seconds and letting your paper dry, and then you can start to get some of that wet on damp effect. And you can also see you can use that soft thirsty brush to lift color. As this continues to dry, I can drop more and more color in here. And if I want to be more precise in my practice, I can look at that reference photo and try and start copying some of the lines that I see. Or I can just kind of play around with the techniques until I'm comfortable with the wet on wet, wet on damp, and wet on dry. It's just going to be a good way to get practice without having to work on the whole flower all at once. And I should mention, I didn't get those purple undertones on here first. All I'm doing right now is just showing you how to practice detail so that you can feel more confident when you actually approach the creases and folds in your own work. Then I'm using my brush and I'm just softening things because things are almost too dry now and I want a little more softness. Okay, I'm going to refine this a bit so it looks a little more like what I see in the reference photo. And I'll just use my brush to kind of blend things a little bit. And then finally, I'm going to use a little more concentrated paint right here as I do these strong, bright red details that you can see. And at this point, the paper is most definitely more damp than wet, and that's allowing me to achieve and maintain those details. And I did all of this without drying anything, without layering. I did it all in one shot. Why don't we repeat this petal? But this time, instead of pouring so much water on there, I'm going to come in with a little more control so that I start out a little bit closer to wet on damp. Then I'm going to come in And the other thing that will make a difference is how much water you have on your brush, okay? I should mention that as well. If I really wet my brush here, you're gonna see I'm gonna get things really wet again. Even though I haven't got a lot of water on my paper, I'm just gonna show you this so you can see. I come down here and I've got a lot of water on my brush, and once again, things are bleeding around quite a lot. If I tap my brush off, you'll see I can have more control if my brush is not too wet. So once again, you can see the control I get by having both damp paper and a damper brush, or a slightly drier brush. I've tapped it off on my paper first. So that's another thing I should mention to you. If you're just new to painting wet on damp, you're also going to want to make sure you don't have too much water loaded on your brush. All right, so now what I'm going to do is just add water, wash all this kind of down a little bit so we have a nice soft diffuse layer. Because what I want to show you is how you could build layers instead. You can just leave this kind of like a wet on wet approach. So I'm coming back in. This time I am getting a little more water on my brush, and I'm going to try and just achieve a really soft, almost like a wash of pink, but I am coming on still, following the direction of the creases and folds. Then I'm going to guide it around with my water brush here. So my second brush that's just got water, making it a little damp. I'm just going to guide it around with that. Then I'm going to dry this layer and come back in and do the details. So you can see there's more than one way to approach this. So if I look at my reference, I could pay attention to where those whites need to be and lift them, make sure that they're not too pink to start with. And when I'm happy with that, I will get the hair dryer, dry this, and then I'll come back in and add the details. Okay, so now this is dry, and I'm gonna go repeat the steps, except that I'm not putting too much water here. I'm just gonna try and put a nice, I guess you could say kind of a light coat of water. It's not as it's not as flowing as it was when I did this one, right? So I've got a little bit of water on there. And then I'm gonna work a little bit drier and get details that are just a little more refined. So let's try that. And you can actually, with your brush, you can tap it off on the side of your palette to kind of get more of a sharp tip, if you will. So you can see it's kind of like that on one side, a little like that on the other side, or you can even pinch it if you don't mind getting a little paint on your fingers. And you'll have a nice tip here if your brush isn't coming quite to the nice tip that you want it to. Then I'm going to come in here and you can see things are very damp and I'm getting a lot more control. I have a fair amount of paint on my brush as well, like it's fairly concentrated. And I'm just going to come and try and do some of these details with kind of this damp approach, but you can see it's actually almost too crisp, and that's okay. I'm just going to come in here and soften it with this brush, and because this underlayer is dry, it's not lifting. So I'm going to come in and do a few more of these. I could actually have a little more water if I wanted to, and that's okay. We're going to come in and just soften with this brush. So again, come quickly onto this while it's still wet. If you let it dry too much, you won't be able to soften things. But you can see I've got this nice sort of a soft line that hasn't completely vanished. So I'm just going to do a little bit there. Maybe I'll put just a little more water on here because it's just almost drying a little too much, or I don't have enough to start with. So just put a little more water so you get a little more flow. And then I'll come in and do these lines here. Need a little more paint. Just stroke it downwards, a little more paint. It's not perfect, but it's okay. And then down here, it is a little bit on the drier side, and I'll just get more concentrated paint on my brush, and I'll be able to maintain some of these details once again. Same way I did over there on that one, except this time I'm not needing to worry about any of the paint that I've already applied going goofy on me because it's already dry, right? And then I can come in and just do these details afterwards. You might find that easier because if you do it all in one shot, sometimes everything starts moving around on you a little too much. Doing it this way prevents that. And that's why I'd recommend experimenting on a smaller piece of paper, and so that you can figure out the technique that works best for you. And you can also see here how having that second brush on hand is going to help you out. If you enjoy painting these samples with me, you'll definitely want to subscribe so that you can paint this 2-part Amaryllis with me. We're going to walk step by step together through the initial stages of this painting as we paint when on wet, and then finally we're going to work on these gorgeous details together. But I hope you've been inspired to see how values make such a huge difference for realistic art. And the details are more like icing on the cake. The outline for the Amaryllis is already available on my Etsy shop, and so if you want to get it traced ahead of time so that you're ready to paint along with me when part 1 comes out next week, you can go ahead and do that. In the meantime, I hope this tutorial has brought a little taste of God's beauty and peace into your everyday life, and that it's inspired you to continue enjoying your own creative journey. See you again soon. Bye!